Welcome back to another episode of the Power 5 Blitz. I'm Nolan alongside Cappy, and we're going to review the some of the big storylines that happened during week 6 in college football and then kind of preview some of the big games in week 7. Starting off with kind of the big games, Georgia finally dominated in a game. I think that was the second time they scored in the first quarter or something against
hmm
Kentucky in complete domination. Did they show enough for you to kind of be like, okay, they're back to what they should be?
that was what you kind of expected from Georgia from week one. But at this point in the season, you do, it happening once out of 5, 6 weeks.
Yeah.
I don't think what you, I mean, it's not like a trend at this point. Um, so you'd like to see them to come out and do the same thing next week. And then at that point, you're probably thinking, oh, maybe they got it figured out. Everyone talks about last year how they struggled early, but that was like it was like a score struggle. The You look at everything else and they were dominating the game, and then they won 31-20, and so that's just a shit happens in football moment. But this year the scores were a lot more indicative of how they played. So
Mhm.
you'd like for them to see that to continue over these next few weeks. But it was a step in the right direction for Georgia, and they kind of finally looked like what a lot of people thought they were going to look like this year.
Yeah, no, I kind of think with teams like Georgia, Michigan, and those top teams that are supposed to be at the top, I kind of say, show me it, on a consistent basis. Don't blow out one
Mhm.
team in the next 2 weeks, just struggle against, lesser competition that Colorado has been doing. So I want to see Colorado, or not Colorado, Georgia, I mean. So I want to see Georgia do it again. I don't, maybe another 2 weeks in a row, I want to see it from them before I say, okay,
Mhm.
they're back to where they were the past couple of years. And I say 2 weeks just because they're at Vanderbilt, who's horrible. So you can't really get a good test or a good, gauge on them.
Yeah.
At Vanderbilt, it's kind of like if Michigan was going to Northwestern this week and just blowing them out, and you're saying, oh,
Mhm.
they're going to win the Natty all of a sudden. But yeah, I kind of think they got to be on a consistent basis for me to say they're back to how they, Georgia that we know. But until I see that, I still think they're not the best team in the country, and I still think their
Mhm.
ranking is due to the fact they've won two natties in a row and haven't lost yet.
Yep. Mhm.
All right, moving on. We had the Red River Showdown this past weekend, and that was a great game. I don't know if you watched
It
it. I'm sure
was.
you did.
Yep.
But do you think we were kind of overrating Texas a little bit? Not me and you to say, but kind of everyone in general.
I'd say a little bit. Um, Not by much though. They were in that 3 to 6 range,
Hmm.
um, which I mean is probably where they should have been. It wasn't like, um, if anything, I think people were more underrating Oklahoma going to that game instead of overrating Texas. I said it this last week. Oklahoma was better than a lot of people were giving them credit for, and they were a lot closer to Texas than a lot of people were giving them credit for. And even though Texas had a few mistakes, so did Oklahoma. And then that's football. And at the end of the day, Texas couldn't get a stop when it mattered, and that's why they lost the football game to Oklahoma. Um, but I do think um, that it wasn't necessarily Texas was overrated. I think it was more so is that we kind of really underrated, or at
Oklahoma.
least the general media underrated how good Oklahoma has been up to this point.
Okay. No, I kind of like that. I didn't think about that. I'll be one. I kind of overrated them a little bit, calling them the best team in the
Mhm.
country last week, or the most complete team, and then they went out and I wouldn't say laid an egg, but they didn't look,
Mhm.
as impressive as I was kind of making them out to be, or kind of thought they were. Um, but no, I like how you said Oklahoma was a little bit underrated by the general media. And I underrated them for sure. I said last week, if you
Mhm.
recall, that they didn't impress me at all against Cincinnati and stuff
Mhm.
like that. And you kind of shot that down right away. So I'll be interested to see how Texas and Oklahoma both finish out the season. I think that's a rematch we
Mhm.
can see in the Big 12 championship for sure.
Mhm.
And I hope we see it. And it might be one of those games where it could screw someone out of a playoff spot. If, say, Oklahoma's undefeated and they lose to Texas, um, it might screw Oklahoma out of the playoff spot just depending on what's happening out around the country. Um, Not really sure how that'll play out because it's college football. Um, But also what happened over the past weekend with Miami, just Mario Cristobal just
Yeah.
I don't know what he was thinking. I saw a video, yep,
Mhm.
today actually, where the special teams coach or O line coach or someone was screaming at him to just call take a knee, and he just ignored him and
Yeah.
running the ball, running the ball. Um, I feel like he's gotten worse since he's left Oregon. That's just me, in my opinion. I don't know.
Mhm. Oregon was a good spot for him, I thought. I didn't think he really had a reason to leave Oregon, and I don't think Miami's an upgrade in terms of a profile job from Oregon. So that was always kind of a weird lateral move, I thought.
Yeah,
Um, I don't think he's a bad coach, but I mean, even when he was at Oregon, he 9-3, 10-2 was about where his team sat, and even though Miami played well to start the year, that's probably where they're going to end up. And that's eventually going to go back to the coach, because that's a game that you shouldn't have lost. And ironically enough, he did this, I think, in 2018, like with Oregon. He didn't take a knee against Stanford, if I recall correctly, and then they ended up losing that game. So it's not like this is the first time he didn't take a knee when he should have. This is a kind of a reoccurring thing, and it's something that you just question from a head coaching standpoint, especially where they were. Um, to that point, though, where they were on the field, the turnover wasn't what was the nail in the coffin. It was the giving up almost 70 yards of offense on 2 plays in 14 seconds.
yeah,
That
that's
just can't happen. Um, and you feel like this is an excuse, but as someone who used to play football, at that point, especially the game, the defense is kind of checked out. So when the defense all of a sudden has to check back in a little bit, that can be a little tough to do to regain focus. And I think you kind of saw that in the drive because there's two really bad coverage busts that led to the Georgia Tech touchdown, which ultimately won them the game.
yeah, yeah. And I think going back to where you said it was a lateral move, it was, but I kind of understood it since he
Mhm.
did graduate from Miami. Um, but at the same time, it's kind of like Miami really wasn't a good program anymore when he took it over. I don't know why he would have jumped ship from Oregon, where he had a comfy job there. They weren't going to fire him. They were happy going 9-3, 10-2 every year, winning the Pac-12 every once in a while. But yeah, to me, that whole to me, I've always found not taking a knee like that against a team like Georgia Tech is enough to put you on the hot seat, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Especially after a poor season last year. They're not going to do very well this year, but I mean, he's a graduate of Miami. He's only been there for a year and a half, so he probably won't be put on the hot seat. I also hold coaches at programs like that to higher standards than most
Mhm.
people, but that's kind of just my thoughts on it.
Yeah, it is like you said, something that can't happen. But Miami wasn't a good spot when he took over, so you got to give him at least a 3-4 year window. If he's not winning with his guys 2 years from now, then it's probably not going to happen. I mean, at that point, you can talk about moving on and finding someone else.
Yep. No, I totally agree with that. Kind of moving to the Big Ten now. Um, conference is just really three teams and then everyone else. But
Mhm.
two teams played this past weekend. We'll start with Ohio State. They were hosting Maryland. In that first half, they just got dominated by Maryland, in my opinion. The score
Mhm.
didn't show it. I think Maryland
Mhm.
blew it at the end of the first half there, not, thrown to the end zone and then taking a field goal if they failed to convert a touchdown. Um, but that's another topic. So, what are your kind of thoughts on Ohio State so far this year and kind of, this past week against Maryland?
Their line, especially on offense, is still a massive issue. I talked about this earlier in the year that they really didn't have a good line last year, and they didn't do anything to fix it. Um, and it's kind of rearing its ugly head. Penn State has I don't think they have a super good defensive front, or not super good, super great, but definitely a good defensive front. Um, and so that's like a front that I feel like could give them some issues, even though I don't think Penn State's D tackles are super good. But I do think that the front, especially the edges Penn State has, could give Ohio State a lot of issues because their offensive line especially, isn't that good.
Right.
The edges haven't took the step forward that a lot of fans wanted them to take, or a lot of people thought they would take. The interior is pretty good. but again, the edges I would say are kind of underperforming, especially the expectations of Sawyer and
Yeah.
JT are both 5 stars coming out of high school. They're not supposed to be average Big Ten or slightly above average Big Ten players. They're supposed to be all American caliber players, and
Mhm.
that's not what they are right now. Um, and so Ohio State has a lot of problems right now. And I said, I don't know I don't know how, Ryan Day could fix it this year. McCord isn't playing bad, but the line's not helping them out much. They're really struggling to run the football. They couldn't run it at all against Maryland. And while their defense has played pretty good, I do question their secondary a little bit, and I question their edges a little bit. And teams like Michigan and Penn State, who kind of got um, things figured out on offense in those areas, could give Ohio State a challenge because we really don't know much. Yeah, they played really good against Notre Dame, or they beat Notre Dame, but they didn't really outplay Notre Dame, and Notre Dame's continued to show cracks over these last few weeks.
Yeah.
So in retrospect, it's probably gonna be like last year where you thought it was a good win. And then you look at it, week 12, 13, and Notre Dame sitting at 3, 4 losses, and you're like, maybe not.
Yeah. No, the edge thing that you brought up, that's concerning to me just because
Mm-hmm.
TTT, I mean, he's a good player. I don't think he's an all-American player, but I think he's all Big Ten player. But he was the number one recruit out of high school. Jack Sawyer was the number two or number three overall recruit out of high school, and he's just been a disappointment for Ohio State. He's still solid to say, but he's not,
Mm-hmm.
he's not scaring any tackles. And then their offensive line, I thought it was going to be good coming into the year. Um, but and I thought they were good after the first few weeks, but they did not look good, this past Saturday. And that's a real concern because that was a little bit of a concern last year too. That the past couple of years, in my opinion. And I think that's kind of a big reason they lost to Michigan. Michigan was able to get to Stroud, um, and
Mm-hmm.
McCourt's not as athletic as Stroud. So if those tackles, don't hold up against Michigan's pass rush, which isn't as good as it has been in the past couple of years, but good enough, um, they'll be able to take down McCourt, and they'll be in real trouble against a team like Michigan, and then again a team like Penn State, like you said, with like Chop Robinson on the edge there. Um, but I'm also concerned about Ohio State's run game. Um, I was a big believer in Mayan Williams and Trey Henderson, and then also they have Chip Trainum as a RB3 who's kind of moved up the depth chart now to RB2. Some may say RB1 based on attempts, but it just does not look as good as it probably could be, and I think that's going to hurt them down the road against big D lines.
Yeah, the running game is an issue. I said this. I don't know if I saw this to you, but I said this kind of at the end of last year. Trainum looked like their best back. Um, and that's not what you want to say. The fact that a converted linebacker um, from Arizona State is your best back when you have what you should have, Trayvon Henderson and Mine Williams being the 1 and 2. Um, I don't think it's not out of the realm possibility for linebackers to make good transitions to running backs, but at a program like Ohio State, a linebacker shouldn't make a transition to running back and then immediately become your best back, which is almost what happened last year, even though he wasn't getting a lot of carries. And that's kind of carried into this year. When I've watched Ohio State, Trainum's been by far their best back because he's 240 but moves like he's 215. And um, Ohio State obviously wants to get Williams and Henderson going, but at this point they almost need to go with Trainum kind of as the full time running back one because you're getting to a point to where you can't afford to not run the football, especially against some of the better competition I'll face here in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and I talked to Steven, who's been on an episode with us
Mm-hmm.
before preseason. I asked him, about the depth chart for running backs, um, and he actually said that he thinks Chip Trainum could be the starter preseason, which I should have caught that and been like, oh, that might be an issue if Henderson and Mayan Williams can't beat out what you said, converted linebacker from Arizona State. Um, that might be an issue right there, and I should have maybe caught that, but yeah, so it's an issue to me. I think it's got to improve if they want to even come close to beating Michigan this year, which is weird to say.
Mm-hmm.
Saying that about Ohio State. Um, But staying in the Big Ten, going to Michigan now, they're kind of separating themselves from everyone else in the Big Ten. And I shouldn't say everyone else. I should say the other big two, Penn State and Ohio State, recently. But how much weight do you put on their past couple games against Nebraska and Minnesota on the road? Both those programs are pretty rough, and they're having bad seasons. So how much weight do you put on those wins?
I still think they matter. They've really thoroughly dominated both those games.
Mhm.
And I was reading something today in their first three conference games. I think last year in 2021, their score differential was like plus 40 and plus 31, which is good, but not what you want it to be. This year it's plus 104. I think that that is something to note. Um, they they're the most complete team in the country, I think. Um, and I mean, they like I said, their pass rush is better than people give it credit for, just because of their interior.
Mhm.
They got, and I think three future first rounders on the defensive line that they rotate right now, and Chris Jenkins, Mason Graham, and Kenneth Grant. Their edges aren't bad. Harrell's really, really good, really solid. McGregor's kind of becoming really good here. Stewart and Moore have kind of gotten better as the season progresses, and those are kind of guys that a lot of people thought might be able to contribute this year, but is really more of a next year guy. And if they keep going at the rate they're going, it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility that they're legit edge threats by the time the brunt of their schedule comes in November. Their secondary is good as we know. They got a good linebacking group. And then on offense, their offensive line again is probably one of the best in the country. The running back room's great. JJ's playing out of his mind, and they've quietly had a really, really good year from the wide receivers and tight ends.
Mhm.
Um, and it's like so they're the most complete team in the conference, most complete team in the country, I think. Um, and I really do think that they're starting to create some ground here. And we're kind of getting to the point where you kind of usually think of Ohio State as the top dogs of the Big Ten. You're getting close to the point where I don't think many people are saying that, at least this year, and that Michigan's kind of taking that spot as the really the national contender in the Big Ten that the Big Ten always has.
Yeah, when a team plays a schedule like Michigan has, um, I kind of look at it as when you watch the games, do they look like they're just 100 times better than that team, or do they look like they're struggling a little bit and playing down to competition, um, like kind of Georgia has been the past couple of weeks outside of Kentucky, and with Michigan they look like they go in there and they dominate, and I mean you can see it when JJ and Blake Corum haven't played a fourth quarter all year, and we're halfway through the year.
Mm-hmm.
I've never seen a stat like that, and then also, their defense has scored more touchdowns than they've let up touchdowns, at least their starting
Mm-hmm.
defense, which is another extremely impressive stat. Um, but you mentioned their scoring differential. Was that? Did you say that was just conference games, right?
Yeah, the first three conference games.
Yeah, and to me that just kind of shows how much of an impact Jim Harbaugh has on this team. Since he didn't coach the non-conference games, they looked good, but they didn't look like they have been in conference plays against better teams. Um, so to me, that's just one thing I wanted to note with them. Um, But yeah, to me, after watching the past couple games for them, they do look like they're better than Georgia, at least for now. And I was looking at strength of schedule. I was just curious, kind of going back to do they look like they're dominating? According to FPI, which I'm not a fan of FPI, it was just the quickest thing I could pull up here. Their strength of schedule is 111. Penn
Mm-hmm.
State 110. So Penn State is only one higher and still ranked in the top six.
Mm-hmm.
But when you watch those two teams, you just see that Michigan is another level above Penn State right now,
Mm-hmm.
on offense and defense. So that's kind of another point to kind of back up what I'm saying. Um, when you watch the teams, do they look like they're head and heels above everyone else? And Michigan does, and Penn State doesn't at times, and their schedules have been, about the same based on FPI.
Yeah, the like I said, they've really dominated, and they showed no signs of slowing down. A lot of people point at the non-conference, but from a schematic perspective and a play calling perspective, they were just kind of trying things to see if it could work or not. There's a few things that they ran a lot in non-conference play that completely shelved now that conference plays are rolled around. I think that was just to see if they could run it.
Mhm.
Um, and then they really slowed down those games in non-conference play. I think they averaged less than um, nine possessions a game. So I mean, really, they have two possessions a quarter,
Yeah.
and they're in and out. So it wasn't really conducive to running up the score like other teams have in non-conference game. But now that they took the conference slate, at least the first three games, a lot more serious than they ever took any of the non-conference games, and it shows. Um, a lot of the metrics and stuff are still really, really good, but now they're getting more drives, extending games, not really trying to slow the game down. The scores are finally reflecting of how they're playing.
Yeah. Yeah, and like you said, non-conference they tried a lot of things, which I think a lot of those type of teams do against
Mm-hmm.
teams that they played. Um, but then yeah, conference play it seems like they're trying to show the world that they had a lot of people come back and they're ready to win a national championship,
Mm-hmm.
and that they can. They're not one of those teams that loses big games like
Mm-hmm.
they are. Um, there's one thing I wanted to mention about Michigan, but it slipped my mind. I wanted to ask you about Michigan. That's all right though. Um, moving on, something we haven't done yet. Um, but we're about halfway through the year. So we're gonna rank our top 10 teams so far. Um, I don't know how you rank teams. I rank teams a little bit different, probably. But starting off with 10, who do you have as your number 10 team?
My number 10 team. So I kind of rank it more of like as a poll as opposed to like rankings of how teams played this year. So I took into account where you thought they were going to be based on how they played a year ago and things like that. So right now, my number 10 team is North Carolina. Um, uh, Spoiler, I do not have USC in my top 10 because USC does not have a defense. And even though there was a problem last year and it hasn't gotten fixed, and so they lost three times last year, twice to Utah, and once to Tulane, and that loss is coming for USC because their defense is not good. So I don't think it's a matter of if USC is going to lose; it's a matter of when, and so that they're kind of my first team out. But North Carolina is my 10th team. Um, they've been pretty solid this year on a relatively weak ACC. Drake May is playing really, really good at quarterback. He's really solidifying his top five draft stock, I think.
Mhm.
Um, and that alone will help you a lot. Uh, I was kind of talking to people, when you have an NFL quarterback in college football, you're usually going to win 8, 9 games at the bare minimum, unless your roster around it's really, 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 really bad. I mean, you have guys like Patrick Mahomes and, Jared Goff who don't necessarily play for winning teams, but 9 times out of 10, when there's an NFL quarterback, um, on a roster, that team's going to win 9, 10 games. And so I do think that really helps UNC. Their defense is playing pretty good. And so for that reason, they're my number 10 team right now.
Okay. At number 10, I do have USC. Barely. I had a
Mhm.
UNC at 11 for me if I were to go another spot. Um, but the thing with USC for me is they're and the defense sucks in my opinion. But for me, I still think their offense is good enough to give them a little bit of an edge over UNC. Small one that they could change, this week very easily. Um, and then also another team that I was considering at 10 was Bama. And that kind of just shows I don't think there's really 10, elite teams, I guess you could say, or 10 great teams in college football. I think there's only 8 or 9. So yeah, I have USC at 10. I'm not overly fond about it or anything like that.
Mhm.
I don't have much to say about them, obviously. Um, Other than like I kind of agree with where they are in the AP poll 10. I think it's very close though with UNC, USC, and Bama kind of right there in the
Mhm.
in that range. Moving on to number 9. Who's in your number 9 spot?
That'd be Texas for me. I don't think that their loss last week was as bad as a lot of people make it seem. But you do, kind of at this point, I try to avoid, putting one loss teams, super, super high, especially when their other teams are undefeated, because it does matter a little bit of what you've done. Um, so, they did lose to Oklahoma, who's a really, really good team. Um, and I do think they're better than a few other undefeated teams, Louisville, North Carolina, um, North or USC, things like that. So I do think that they deserve to be inside the top 10. I kind of have them sitting at 9 right now because they're, in my opinion, the best one-loss team out there. And I don't think they're really going to kind of miss a beat after losing to Oklahoma.
Okay. Uh, At number 9, this is probably going to upset some people, but I do have Penn State. Um, and a big reason is I mean, outside of Iowa, I haven't seen anything that has really wowed me.
Mhm.
I wasn't high on them coming into the season. I wanted to see kind of what Drew Aller was before, raising my expectations for them. So I have them at 9. Um, I mean, it's nothing against really Penn State. I'm not saying they're bad or anything. I just think I haven't seen enough to put him over, Washington, Oregon, Texas, teams that are going to be, ranked above them, in my opinion. And I've seen better performances from those three teams I just listed than Penn State. So that's kind of where I'm at with Penn State in my number 9 spot. Number
Mhm.
8, who you have slotted in at 8.
Number 8 is Penn State. Um, I do think they're one of the bottom tier undefeated teams. They're a good team, and they were kind of in that 8 to 12 range last year. I think they're about the same as they were last year. Um, so I have them sitting at 8. Granted, that can change, especially if they win some games down the stretch. But right now, they just haven't shown me anything to give me the idea um, that they're going to be, in that top tier teams this year.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I thought I was, the only one who Penn State that low, but it sounds like you're in that same range. Number 8, I have Oregon. Um, I think they're really close in the for my ranking. Or I'm sorry, not Oregon. I have Texas at number 8. I got ahead of myself there. Um, I did have them higher, but to me, they looked very disappointing this past weekend.
Mm.
In a loss, I couldn't rank them above an Oregon or Washington who were undefeated, and have looked a little better consistently. So I have them at number 8. Could be higher, I don't know. Could be lower, like yours, but yeah, I have them at number 8. Number 7.
Number 7 is Oregon. Um, the 4 through 7 range, a lot of these teams I think are fairly close to each other. Oregon and I'm not going to spoil my next team, but Oregon, they have a really good offense. I still have a little bit of questions about their defense, even though Dan Lanning's the coach there. I do think their defense has a little bit of holes that you can attack into it. But they're a really good team. And they're playing one of my other top 10 teams this week. So you really learn a lot about both teams. And uh, both Oregon and Washington both have really, really good offenses, but their defenses are a little bit lacking. Washington more so. Um, but so you'll really find out a lot about both those teams here in the next week.
Okay, I also have Oregon at number 7. I kind of spoiled that a minute ago, but
Mhm.
for all the same reasons you kind of had, I like Oregon a lot. I think the winner of this upcoming Oregon Washington game that we'll get into a little later will kind of determine who's the front runner for the
Mhm.
Heisman, depending on what quarterback wins. But yeah, I have Oregon at 7. Number 6.
Number 6, I have Washington. Um, Once again, the really 4 through 7 can be interchangeable for me. And again, Oregon and Washington, they're a little bit more one-dimensional than the teams at 4 and 5. Uh, so I have Washington there for that reason. They're really, really, really good offensively, but their defense isn't super good. Um, and eventually that's going to come back to bite you. They really kind of remind me of a vintage Lincoln Riley uh, Oklahoma team.
Mhm.
Really, really good offense. Defense is a little bit above average, but when your defense has a bad game, that's not a recipe for success. And I do think that at some point this year, their defense is going to kind of lay an egg, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I also have Washington in that spot. I really think they're a better version of USC,
Mhm.
in that opinion. Um, I I don't see them dropping very far in my rankings, at least if they lose to Oregon on the road. They'll obviously drop, but I don't see them dropping too far. So I like them at 6. Number 5, who do you have?
Number 5, I have Florida State. Um, the they're a good team, um, but I really think they're kind of a tier below um, the top 3. They've had a few scares. They've gotten lucky a few times, and I do think that while they're pretty solid, I don't think that they're good enough to one run the table, um, but two, I don't think it's a slam dunk that they're gonna even win the ACC at this point, because they're really not that much better than a team like UNC who's sitting at 10 for me. So I have Florida State sitting at 5.
I have Ohio State in this spot.
Mm.
And a big reason is, to me, they didn't look good last week. I mean, the score shows that they won by 20, but if you actually watch the game, they didn't look good. I didn't think they looked great against Notre Dame. And they didn't look good against Indiana. I don't really care what they did against Youngstown State or Western Kentucky. But in their three kind of biggest games, they haven't really looked great, in my opinion. And then I would have had them at like 4, maybe 3, if it weren't for the fact that Notre Dame has looked like garbage the past couple weeks. And it kind of, to me, that kind of, lowers their
Mhm.
win against Notre Dame. So I have them at 5, very close to number 4. But moving on to number 4, who do you have?
I have Ohio State. Like I said, they can kind of be interchangeable with any of the last 3 teams I mentioned.
Mhm.
But they've just been the best team, in my opinion, out of those 3. Especially a lot of their underlying stats look pretty good. They're relatively efficient. They can generate explosives at a decent rate, and their defense has been pretty good. Albeit, I do think they have a little cracks. I just think they have a better offense than Florida State's shown this year, and I think their defense is slightly better. And so, like I said, for that reason, it's really tough for me to justify Florida State ahead of them, even though I think they're kind of very comparable teams in the grand scheme of things.
At number 4, I have Oklahoma. As I mentioned before, I wasn't as high as you were on them, coming into the week.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now I'm high enough to put them into the top 4 and playoff spot. Right now, I think Dylan Gabriel is really good. I'm curious to see how he'll do without Andrel Anthony, who's kind of been one of his go-to receivers this year.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's leading the team in catches, and he's out for either the year or a couple weeks. So I have them at number 4. I think they are very close to the number 3 spot, who we'll get into here in a second. So who's at your number 3?
Number 3 for me is Oklahoma. Um, Oklahoma is a really, really good football team, and Venables has that defense turned around. It's not their typical Oklahoma. Their defense is really good. Their offense is really good, and they've played really complementary football to each other. In terms of like elite teams from years past, I want to say they're at that level, but because the general, kind of in general this year, with things being down in college football, that kind of allows them to be sitting there at 3. If this Oklahoma team was playing like this a year ago, they're probably 5 or 6.
Mhm.
But this year they're sitting at 3 just because, either the packs moved up to the top or the tops kind of fell back down to the pack a little bit, whatever you want to say.
Yeah, at 3 I have Florida State. And like I just mentioned, very close to Oklahoma at number 4. Could be
Mhm.
interchangeable. Um, so I mean, I really don't have much to say other than I kind of just didn't see it being a point where they looked good this past week. If I should drop them a spot just because Oklahoma beat Texas in the Red River Showdown, so I kept them at 3.
Yep. And then so my number 2 team is Michigan, and then that would make my number 1 Georgia. Um, I think Michigan's played better this year, but Georgia's gotten to the point to where they're in that Alabama territory where they get a longer leash and the benefit of the doubt more than the average team would. It's hard to watch them play the way they have the last few years and then completely throw that under the rug. And so right now, those are my number 1 and number 2 in terms of like, a standard AP poll if I was voting. Um, but yeah, I think Michigan's played better this year, but at the same time, unless Georgia would lose or Michigan would dominate their November slate, it would be really difficult for me to kind of flip flop those two just because what Georgia's done the years prior and what you kind of thought they would be at the beginning of the year. Um, but I would say kind of both those teams are have separated themselves from the pack. And I would say, if I'm making a power rankings, I think Michigan's a little bit better than Georgia. But I've kind of made it like an AP poll. So I do have Georgia at 1 and Michigan at 2.
Yeah, I actually have those two flipped. So I have Georgia at
Mm-hmm.
2, Michigan at 1. And a reason being, I'm not big into putting a lot of stock into, if any at all, into kind of their program reputation or what they did last year or anything like that. I think I mentioned it last week or mentioned to you off recording
Hmm.
or something that I think they shouldn't even rank teams until maybe week 6, week 7, right around this
Hmm.
time. I think rankings should show kind of what a team is like this year, more so than what you kind of expect him to do, which is the preseason pool. Um, that's just kind of my opinion on that. So I do have Michigan at 1 compared to Georgia at 2, just because I do think they've looked a little more dominant
Hmm.
compared to Georgia and more consistent. Um, Georgia's played a little bit of a tougher schedule, obviously, but um, I think just watching the two teams play, I think there's only, if any, I think, I don't even know if there's a team that could beat Michigan right now. And with Georgia, I think there's a few that could beat Michigan or beat Georgia right now. Um, if they played on a neutral field. So that's just kind of my few reasons on why I have Michigan at 1 compared to Georgia at 2. But both teams, like you said, I think they're in a tier of their own right now compared to the rest of college football. Moving on to kind of picks for this weekend. Not a big weekend to say. Um, 4 kind of ranked matchups that I like. Starting off with kind of the game of the week, Oregon, Washington, and kind of just talk about what you expect in this game and then, who you got.
I think Washington's going to win the game this week. I expect this to be a very, very high scoring game. I kind of said this last week. The Pac-12 this year has kind of taken over the role of the traditional Big 12, and that a lot of teams in the Pac-12 are really, really, really good offensively, but then defensively, not so much. So I do think it's going to lead to a lot of shootouts, especially against the top tier Pac-12 teams. And so, the two of those are Oregon and Washington. I wouldn't be surprised if this is like a 45-45 game in the fourth quarter. If both teams could very easily hang 50 points. They like to speed up the game. They like to run tempo, and they don't like to slow it down. Um, so it's really going to be I think a very high scoring game, but I do think at the end of the day, Washington pulls it out. Like I said, I do have questions about Oregon's defense, and I don't think Oregon's defense is good enough to slow down Washington's offense enough to where Oregon's going to be in a spot where they're going to have to pretty much match Washington step for step, and that's tough to do if your defense doesn't get stops.
Yeah, I also agree. I think Washington's going to win the game. And apologies, I said earlier Washington was going to Oregon. It's actually the other way around. But I'm just a big fan of Michael Penix. I was last year as well, going into the year. I think he should be the Heisman winner so far this year over Caleb Williams. I know the stats don't really show it, but just when I watch him play, I'm just extremely impressed with basically everything he does.
Mhm.
And kind of the thing about this game, I think it's going to be a complete shootout. Like I'm talking both teams in the 50s. Um, I mean, what? Let's look at here. Penix is third in the country in touchdowns at
Mhm.
16, 2,000 yards. Bo Nix is eighth in the country at 15 touchdowns, 1,500 yards. Both teams like to air it out a lot. So I think it's going to be both teams scoring in the 50s, which
Mhm.
I like watching games like that. I don't know what time the game is. Is it a 7:30 game or is it a Pac-12 after dark game?
I think it's 7:30 game.
7:30.
Either 7:30 or 3:30.
Okay.
That's when most of the big Pac-12 games happen.
Yeah.
Because you're not. I mean, you're losing East Coast viewership when you put a game like that
Yep.
starting at like 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock on Eastern time. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
It's like it's at 3:30 Eastern time.
mhm.
So, um, no night atmosphere, which is always fun. But yeah, I think it's going to be an exciting game. Probably the best game of the week. Looking at the not probably it should be. Looking at the rest of the game slates, but yeah, I like you said, I'm with Washington that week. This week, I do think Oregon. I don't think they'll lose any credit, if any at all.
Yep.
If they lose, as long as they don't get blown out like 60-0.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it'll be close. Next game on the list, we have USC at ND, or Notre Dame. Notre Dame's been struggling lately. USC's looks good, nothing special, but they look good. What are your thoughts on this game?
This game, I this one's tough to gauge. I do think USC is going to ultimately win. But USC's defense is. I think they're able to play well enough to slow down Notre Dame enough to outscore. But if the defense, or if Notre Dame can slow down USC's offense and make it more of a slow Big Ten ACC style football game, I really do think USC's in trouble. Especially because if Notre Dame gets a ball with 2 minutes left, they're going to run out the clock and win the game.
Yeah.
If it's like a tie game, um, but I do think, in a lot of games this year, Notre Dame hasn't really been able to play at the tempo they want to. And I think that's going to translate to this game. I think this is going to become a track meet. And when it becomes a track meet, that favors the team who prefers to play in the track meet, and that is USC.
Yeah, I have USC winning this game as well. My big thing is based on what I've watched between the both teams the past couple weeks is Notre Dame's just really struggling right now. Um, and I don't really know what it is. I know Sam Hartman's doing bad. I'm pulling up his stats right now. Kind of see what he's done the past couple games stat wise. Um, and give me a second here. Past couple games, I mean, Louisville and Duke, solid teams, but teams Notre Dame should beat, even if they're on the road. And they went 1-1 in those. Completed barely 50%, had 2 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. Nothing special from a guy like Sam Hartman, who has potential to be, a top 3 quarterback in the country. Um, so that's kind of why I have USC. I do like your point in if it's a ACC Big Ten style game, it's going to favor Notre Dame a lot. Um, just because, I mean, if they're trying to run out the clock, USC is not stopping them at all for a first down.
Mhm.
They're just going to be able to easily get their first down and ice the game late in the game. Um, but yeah, just because Notre Dame's been struggling, I think another ranked team is going to be 4 in a row coming, um, and playing Notre Dame. I think that's going to hurt them. So I got USC winning. I think it'll be
Yep.
close, though, still. Game number 3 that we have on the list, Miami UNC. You think Miami's going to have another, dumb moment there at the end of the game?
I don't think they'll have the opportunity to, because I think the game will probably be over by the middle of the third quarter. Um, I just don't see Miami being able to hang with Drake May, North Carolina's offense. Um, they still have some work to do. They played well, but there's some holes, and they still have some work to do, as I said. And so I really think this is going to be one of those games which probably close early, maybe close to halftime, and then you look at the game. You flip it off, and then you turn it back on, and there's 2 or 3 minutes left to go in the third quarter, and North Carolina's up 21, and then that's kind of that. Um, I will say though, if Miami, they got to try to shorten the game and hang in there, because if you can get to a one score 10 point game with 13, 14 minutes left, as Miami won last week, um, even in less time, but anything can happen in college football when you keep games close. So uh, I do think that if Miami can keep it close, they give themselves at least a fighter's chance.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I don't think they'll have the chance to mess up the game at the end with the kneel down or
Mm.
anything like that. I was just a little shocked there looking at, kind of Drake May stats. I haven't been following North Carolina a lot. Hate to say it because I like Drake May. I was kind of shocked to see he only has an 8-4 touchdown to interception ratio. Um, but I still think he's one of the best quarterbacks in college football.
Mhm.
Regardless, I'm not a big box score watcher. Just wanted to throw that in there. But yeah, I think North Carolina will take care of them pretty easily.
Yep.
Um, Last game we have on the list, UCLA, or as I apparently like to call them, UCLA State,
Mhm.
at Oregon State. Who you got?
I think Oregon State's probably going to win this one. I mentioned this a few weeks ago when we were talking about UCLA at Utah. Um, when you have a freshman quarterback, especially on the road, they tend to struggle. That was true at Utah, and it's been pretty true so far in Pac-12 play for Dante Moore. Um, Not saying that Dante Moore is going to be bad next year, or even 2 years from now. I think he has really, really high ceiling. I think he's going to be really good. The fact he is playing as a freshman says something.
Yeah.
But as Dante Moore's learned over the past few weeks, big boy college football is a lot different than big boy high school football. Um, and so there is an adjustment period. And, I think once again, he's really facing a somewhat underrated Oregon State team with Ua Ungley at the helm. They have really solid defense. Their running back, I forget his name off the top of my head. I really like. I think he's a really good running back. Um, I just think that you know, in a game where you have two relatively even teams, the more experienced quarterback a lot of times is going to come out on top. And Oregon State has that new Ungale. And, maybe if this game was played 2 years from now, UCLA blows them out the water. But because you're starting a true freshman quarterback, that's makes it tough to win these types of games.
Yeah, and this is something we've been saying for a few weeks now, like 3 or 4 straight weeks. Me, you, and Chase, that you know, if you have a freshman quarterback starting, like you said, they're going to struggle. Great experience, in my
Mm.
opinion, if you know you're not ready to win, and you have a guy like Dante Moore sitting there, may as well get him in compared to whoever else they have at quarterback on their team. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, I think Oregon State will take him pretty easily. I like DJ coming into the year. I think it was a good place for him to kind of rejuvenate his career. I don't think he's anything special still, but I think he's kind of done that a little bit based on the few games I've watched of Oregon State. So yeah, I like Oregon State in this one. I wouldn't say easily. I don't think their offense is a high powered offense, but I think they'll, if I had to put a score on it, 31-17 or something like that. Um, something a comfortable win, I guess I should say.
Yep.
So that's kind of my win. Um, are there any other games you kind of wanted to just mention or anything? Because those are kind of the four games that we kind of had on our sheet that we were going to talk about.
No, no, not off the top of my head. Usually, we're at the point in the year where you're going to get a few dead weeks and a few fun weeks, and then usually November it starts to ramp up. So
Mhm.
at the point of the year, especially after the Red River rivalry, you can always look forward to that in the beginning of October, and then the 3 weeks in between, or 2 or 3 weeks in between Red River rivalry and November football. Usually a lot of upsets happen there, but it's usually not a lot of good games um, in terms of ones that you know you're going to be good heading into it.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's not a very fun weekend, like I mentioned, like you've mentioned. So just a couple games to watch for, and then if you love college football like me and you do, we're going to be watching a bunch of other games that are kind of meaningless
Yep.
and going to be blowouts, but we watch them to enjoy college football. So that's all
Yeah.
I've got. If you got anything else, now would be the time to say it.
Nope.
All right.
Ready for
Well,
another week of college football?
yep, everyone is, I think. Well, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time.